You got this young kid, he's very privileged. He's got all kinds of things he could do in his life. What does it say about London that the thing he wanted was to be the son of a Russian oligarch?
I'm Michael Tamblyn. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest, the journalist Patrick Radden Keefe, is a very busy guy. He's been writing for The New Yorker since 2006. He's the author of nonfiction bestsellers, including Empire of Pain and Say Nothing. And his new book is London Falling, a mysterious death in the Gilded City and a family's search for truth. Patrick Radden Keefe, welcome to Kobo.
It's so good to be with you.
In the very first pages, the only thing we are sure of is a young man named Zach falling to his death. He falls from the balcony of a luxury apartment building overlooking the Thames in London, and it is by all accounts a suicide. What I find so interesting about this story is that everything after that is like a Rorschach test that shows whatever your greatest anxieties are. If you're a parent, it's about watching your child making choices that pull him away from you towards danger or death, or it shows the corrosion of a certain kind of materialism, or your frustrations with policing, or if you love London or live in the UK, it shows you a city that may have lost its soul. It contains multitudes. Before we get into it, set the opening scenes for us. From that first scene on the balcony, how does the story take its first steps forward?
So London these days is a kind of glass and steel city, right? You have all these big luxury buildings that have gone up lining the Thames, the river that kind of snakes through London. And one night in 2019, in November 2019, a cold night, there was a building that had just gone up a few years before called Riverwalk, and it's just next to Vauxhall Bridge. It's actually across the river from MI6 headquarters, the spy agency that people would recognize from James Bond movies. And there's a strange thing that's happened in London in recent decades, which is that a lot of really wealthy people have come from other parts of the world and bought luxury real estate in London, really more as an investment than anything else. And so they often don't live there for much of the year. And so you can go to these certain neighborhoods where if you walk around after dark, all the buildings are dark. There aren't any lights on. The press in London has a nickname for them. They call them ghost mansions. So this is kind of a ghost mansion neighborhood and this big building, Riverwalk, and it's almost completely dark except for the 5th floor, which is blazing with light. And a surveillance camera on MI6 headquarters picked up, this is after midnight, kind of the wee hours of the morning, picked up footage of a young man walking out onto the balcony of this luxury apartment. And he kind of walks over to one corner of the balcony and he seems to peer over the edge looking down and then over to another corner. And he goes back to the middle of the balcony and he jumps off and into the Thames.
Tell me how you happened upon this story in the first place and how you came to meet the Brettlers.
You know, it's funny. I've been doing this 20 years, and I have found that when I go looking for a good story, I almost never find one. And as often as not, they find me in these kind of unexpected ways. And one thing that I've gotten better at maybe over the years is I try to start conversations with strangers. Drives my kids crazy. We'll get in the back of an Uber, and I will immediately start interrogating the Uber driver. But I have found that the best stories you're probably not going to find on the computer. And so I just kind of go out in the world and I chat with people. And in this case, in the summer of 2023, I was living in London, producing a TV drama for FX based on my book, Say Nothing. Mm-hmm. And so I had actually moved my family over there for the summer. I was on set one day. And, you know, anyone who's spent any time on a film set knows that from the outside, they seem like the most glamorous place in the world. But if you actually get onto a film set, it's deadly boring much of the day because people are setting up shots, they're rigging the lights. Everybody's just kind of waiting around. And on this particular day, I was just sitting on my phone doing the Wordle when a guy plopped down next to me who I didn't know, a stranger. And we got to talking. And He was a lawyer in London. He asked me what I did. I said, I write for the New Yorker magazine. I write these kind of investigative narrative pieces. And he said, I might have a story for you.
Is that a common occurrence? Do
Yeah.
people do that all the time? Yeah.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. Yeah. A lot of people tell me that they have stories for me. And it's tricky because often as soon as they start talking, I know that it probably isn't a story for me. It's like, you have a story. It's just not a story for me.
Right.
And I always have to be polite and, you don't want to kind of rain on people's parade. But these pieces that I write are these big, long, investigative kind of melodramas. There have to be twists and turns. There's a lot of ingredients, and it's usually 6 months of my life, sometimes a year. So it's a big commitment. In this case, this guy just said a few sentences, and I knew I was in on the basis of this quick, casual pitch. He said, there's a family here in London who I'm really close with. They're good friends of mine. And in 2019, they had this tragedy happen. So this is 2023 when we're having the conversation. In 2019, they lost their teenage son. His name was Zach, and he died in mysterious circumstances. He went off the balcony of this luxury building into the Thames. And after he died, his parents made this shocking discovery. They learned that, unbeknownst to them, Zach had had a secret double life, and that as a teenager, he had been going around London, adult London, pretending that he was the son of a Russian oligarch. And he basically said that much, and I knew I have to talk to this family, and if they will trust me to tell their story, I'm in.
How much time did you ultimately spend with the Brettlers, kind of pulling their part of this story out?
So over the next few years, I spent hundreds of hours talking to them.
And what was the portrait that you started to sketch early on of Zach, the young man? And how did that start to evolve over time?
Well, so Zach was born in the year 2000. He's kind of real millennial kid. And he grew up in London, in a nice part of West London, in a really loving family. He had a big brother named Joe, who was a couple years older. His parents, Matthew and Rochelle, who were financially quite comfortable. They came from a upper middle class family who was doing really well. His parents were both professionals. His father was in finance. His mother was a freelance journalist. And he was a kind of fun kid. I think we've all known people like this. He was kind of a zingy, jazzy, like a good conversationalist. He was good at, he told jokes. He was good at doing voices. He was a good mimic. He could do accents. He's kind of a cut up, and he also lied a little bit here and there. He would sort of fib. I always think of Zach as a little bit like a stand-up comic. Stand-up comedian kind of goes through life, and they're living their life, and they're having these experiences, but at the same time, they're always rearranging the things that happen to them into stories and funny stories. And, sometimes you might sort of shave an edge off here, you might embellish a little bit there, and you're always kind of reading the face of the person you're talking to, seeing what they believe, what they find entertaining. Zach was like that. And, he would tell these little lies. There's a story I tell in the book about when he was about 5. He was at a family party, and there was some older girl, like a cousin or something, who slid a little piece of reading material under his nose, and she said, Zach, can you read that? And everybody's kind of looking to see what his answer is. And without skipping a beat, Zach, age 5, says, no, I didn't bring my glasses. And, he didn't wear glasses, and he couldn't read. But that was Zach, and it was kind of fun. He was fun to be around. And then when he hits adolescence, he starts to change, and he starts to sort of slowly become a slightly different person than somebody who increasingly his parents feel like they don't recognize.
I mean, we have a saying in my family, which is, do you want the truth or do you want a good story? So that idea of you embellish because that meets the moment. Yeah. It kind of hits the connection that you're looking for. And when we're the age that Zach is described in the book, that sort of mid to late teens, like that's the time that we're trying on new identities. We change schools, or we go to university, we try on different personas, and we distance ourselves from our parents. But it sounds like what Zach was doing went much farther than that.
Yeah, I mean, you've put your finger on one of the really key elements of the book, which is that the nature of adolescence is that you have to break away from your parents. You have to some extent, start to reject them. Even kids who remain close with their families during adolescence, it's that moment where you sort of realize, actually, my parents are, just kind of messed up, flawed human beings like anybody else. And so Rochelle and Matthew sort of watch their son start to change, and the way that manifested for Zach was that he became really interested in wealth and money and fancy cars, nice clothes, luxury real estate. And he was growing up in a city that was becoming much more kind of blingy and over the top. There was a greater concentration of wealth. I mean, listen, here in Canada, you go to Toronto, you go to Vancouver, some of this will be familiar, right? In recent decades, some of this is about the cities themselves. The landscape looks different. There's more of these kind of luxury amenities, luxury goods, advertising for luxury goods. Some of this is also about the texture of life where everybody's on social media. So Zach was a social media native. He grew up on Instagram. And as any of us know, you have the experience. You're scrolling through Instagram, you see something that catches your eye, you linger for a millisecond with your fingertip, and Instagram knows. It knows what you're interested in. It starts feeding you more. And so for Zach, that was like Lamborghinis, or Bentleys, or luxury apartment buildings. And it would feed him more and more. And he became really taken with this. And he, there was a kind of macho dimension to this. His favorite movie was The Wolf of Wall Street. You or I might watch The Wolf of Wall Street and see it as kind of a funny, entertaining, cautionary tale. He didn't see it that way. And so that was what his parents saw. They didn't know that he'd started inventing this whole other persona. That they had no inkling of until after his death. What they saw was a kid who started saying, why do we drive a Mazda? Like, why don't we have a Range Rover? Why do we live in this apartment? Why don't we live in a bigger apartment? Why don't we buy a mansion? And they were kind of shocked. They didn't really know how to relate to this side of him. And, it grew difficult for them to parent him during this period of time.
And what changes this from just being a story about a young man trying to figure out who he is in the world and distancing himself from his parents, is that he encounters two other major characters in this story, Akbar Shamji and Verinder Sharma. And at first glance, Akbar seems like the kind of guy that often shows up in certain circles of London business. He's a guy in a lot of deals. He's the guy with the new project, a beautiful house, a good car, well-known parents. What was his connection to Zach?
So Zach and Akbar met. We now know, we only sort of figured this out after Zach's death. But basically what happens is one night, Zach is out at a function. He's out at a kind of an art auction at a fancy club in Chelsea. He's there on his own. And, we've all had this experience of you show up at something you agreed to go to, but you don't know anybody there. And you get there and you're kind of looking around and you don't really know who to introduce yourself to. And you get your drink and you're standing there wondering, maybe I should just leave. Nobody would even notice. And then you catch the eye of the other sucker who's there by themselves. And then you realize, okay, well, now I'm going to end up in a conversation with this person totally arbitrarily because they're the only other person who doesn't know anybody. So,
and I'll have this conversation, and then I'll go.
And then I'll go, exactly. Yeah. And in this case, what happened is that Zach, age 18, meets a guy whose name is Mark Foley. And when Zach and Foley start talking, Foley says, well, I work for Chelsea Football Club. Now, this was really interesting for Zach, in part because Chelsea Football Club is one of the most storied English soccer teams, and Zach was into sports. But more to the point, because Chelsea Football Club was owned by Roman Abramovich, and Zach was very interested in Russian oligarchs, and Roman Abramovich was one of the biggest Russian oligarchs. So then Mark Foley says, what about you? And Zach, age 18, says, oh, it's funny, I'm actually the son of a Russian oligarch myself. And I still think, that he was just trying something on. I think this was like, I don't have my glasses. I think he was just seeing, what can I get away with? But the amazing moment in this story is that Mark Foley believes them. Mark Foley, who knows real Russian oligarchs, believes Zach. And they start to talk, and he says, really, well, tell me, tell me more. And Zach says, my father, it's a little ambiguous. Was he Russian? Was he Kazakh? But my father's this oligarch, and I live here in London, and I'm his right-hand man, and we have billions of pounds, and we're looking to invest, and I give him advice on investments. And Mark Foley said, well, I know some guys who are looking for investors. Maybe I could introduce you. So he introduces Zach to a guy named Akbar Shamji. And Akbar is he's kind of what Zach wants to become. So Zach's 18, Akbar's in his 40s. He's a really good-looking guy, kind of a sort of playboy, jet-setting businessman. He's married to this woman, Daniela Carnus, who has a fashion line. She designs fancy gowns for, Gwyneth Paltrow and Meghan Markle and various notable women. Michelle Obama, she's made gowns for all these famous women. And they live in Mayfair, this very posh area, and Akbar drives around in a Mercedes. And Akbar's got this real estate project in Lisbon. He's looking for investors. And so he starts to talk to Zach, thinking Zach is the son of an oligarch who has all this money. And they become friends. And it turns out to be a weird dynamic because Akbar doesn't know that Zach is lying and doesn't actually have all this money, that he's just a regular English kid who lives with his family in Maida Vale, this neighborhood in London. But there are things about Akbar that Zach doesn't see. So Zach doesn't know that Akbar actually is kind of a charlatan. He's not really the businessman he's pretending to be. And in fact, Akbar has just recently declared bankruptcy. So they meet at this kind of interesting time, and they're both sort of BSing the other one.
But he also meets Verinder Sharma, who turns out to be an entirely different kind of character again.
Yeah, so after a time, this whole kind of complicated sequence of things happens where Zach's pretending to be the son of an oligarch, and Akbar's interested in him because he might invest in this real estate project. And Zach sort of says, oh yeah, I'm interested in investing in a real estate project. But he never actually comes through with the money because, we know he doesn't have the money. And at a certain point, it's getting a little awkward because he's supposed to come through with the money and he doesn't. And then one day he says, my father has just died. My father died suddenly, and I don't get along with my mother. She lives in Dubai, and I have all these siblings, and we're all fighting over the inheritance. My mother's actually kicked me out of the luxury apartment that we all lived in, and so I'm temporarily homeless, which is a lot to lay on Akbar. So it's like, I'm a billionaire, but I'm homeless. Anyway, Akbar says, well, I have a friend you could maybe stay with. His name is Verinder. And Zach ends up meeting this guy, Verinder Sharma, who's in his 50s. He seems like a kind of retired businessman. Zach told his parents that Verinder had been like a rubber tycoon, that he'd made a lot of money in the rubber business. But Verinder also is pretending to be somebody he's not. So Verinder lives in this luxury apartment overlooking the Thames. And he basically seems to just kind of work out and hang out most of the day. But Verinder, it turns out, is a gangster. He was a long-time gangster in London, like a leg breaker, an extortionist. He was a guy who, if you owed money to the wrong people, he would dangle you off the roof of a building. In the underworld in London, he was better known by a nickname. They called him Indian Dave. And so Zach, this 18-year-old kid, ends up in this kind of strange relationship with these two older men. Akbar Shamji, this sort of apparently high-flying businessman who's actually secretly a bankrupt charlatan, and Verinder Sharma, the apparently kind of benign, mentor retiree, who is secretly a gangster named Indian Dave.
And it's a cliche to say the city is really a character. People say that about cities and books all the time. But for London, in the story you're telling, London is the setting, but there's also a real question about London's character. Yeah, can you talk a bit about the forces at work in the London of the sort of 2000s, 2010s?
Yeah, it's funny. I think of this book as very much a book about reinvention. So adolescence is a time of reinvention. We all kind of reinvent ourselves. Zach took the idea of reinvention to an extreme, in the sense that he invented a whole new alter ego. I go into the kind of personal histories of Zach and Verinder and Akbar, and you see these interesting stories of reinvention and their backstories with their parents and grandparents. But it's also a story about London reinventing itself. It's about this city that started as one thing and became another. And I have a sort of a personal insight into this because I lived in London in 2000, 2001. Just after I got out of college, I went to grad school there. I lived on the South Bank. I lived near Tower Bridge. And I've watched the city change over the last quarter of a century. And I go back, practically every year. I've got dear friends there. And London transformed, and I think the transformation started at an earlier era. Really, it started in the 1980s, where for centuries London had been a manufacturing town. It was a city where things were built. You had these big factories that lined the Thames, and they kind of belched smoke into the air. It was also a shipping city. It was one of the most important ports in the world in history because of the British Empire. And for hundreds of years, it was a city where, hundreds of ships would come in every week, hundreds of ships would go out. And then a few things happened in the space of about 25 years, really from sort of roughly 1960 to 1985. All the docks closed because there was a new class of container ship that was bigger, and there was the sort of harmonization of global shipping, which meant that you couldn't navigate those container ships in the Thames. And so shipping in England moved elsewhere. And so in the space of 2 decades, all those docks closed. This whole industry that had sustained the city for hundreds of years basically just vanishes practically overnight. At the same time, 80% of jobs in the manufacturing sector disappear in London. The factories mostly close. And so by the mid-'80s, London's kind of faced with this challenge of, well, who are we going to be? We've been a city that built things and a city that shipped things, and now we don't do either of those anymore. So what do? And Margaret Thatcher came in. You had the deregulation of the banking sector. And basically, London sort of reinvents itself as a destination for money and people who have it. And so it's come in here, do your banking here, invest here, pour money into our economy, buy our luxury real estate. The real estate prices go up. There's funny ways in which you notice these things. I lived in London in the year 2000, left in 2001. I had all these friends who were young people in their 20s. And slowly, in ones and twos, I would hear from them because we'd stay in touch over email. They were all leaving the city because they were getting priced out because they couldn't afford to live in London anymore because of the raising real estate prices. And then the Soviet Union collapses and you get the arrival of the Russian oligarchs, and they come in with just bodacious amounts of money. And the city really tried to bring them in. Boris Johnson, before he was prime minister, was the mayor of London. There's a quote in the book where he says, "London is to the billionaire as the jungles of Sumatra are to the orangutan. We are their natural habitat, and we're proud of that." So there was a real sense of let's bring you in. The Trump administration right now in my country, in all its wisdom, is introducing this golden visa program, which basically says if you got enough money, you can kind of buy your way in. And the UK introduced one of those 20 years ago, more, and it really attracted a lot of these oligarchs. So these people come in, and it starts to kind of change the place. And that's the London Zach grew up in. So one of the questions for me from the very start was, when I heard this story, you got this young kid, he's very privileged, he's got all kinds of things he could do in his life. What does it say about London that the thing he wanted was to be the son of a Russian oligarch?
And he'd been put in environments where he had seen the children of oligarchs kind of in their natural habitats. Like he'd been to the good schools, he'd seen where oligarchs coming into London to park their money were also parking their children.
For sure. Yeah. And he went, he was around these kids from the age of 13. He shows up at this school, and there are these kids who are the sons of actual oligarchs and the daughters of actual oligarchs. And they just lived a very kind of ostentatiously blingy lifestyle. They wore designer clothes and they partied in fancy hotels on the weekends. There's a story I tell in the book about how there were dorms on this campus. It was about a 7-minute walk from the dorm to class. And on cold mornings, these oligarchs' kids would summon Ubers to take them from the dorm to class. And so that kind of swaggering, again, like pretty macho coded behavior was all very enticing for a young kid who was figuring out who he wanted to be.
The police get involved after Zach's death, which is viewed as suspicious initially. But the investigation into his death seems to be conducted with, I don't know how you describe it, a lack of curiosity. How would you characterize that investigation in the context of these rich and powerful people?
Well, the first thing to make clear is that when that day on the television set, when I got back to my apartment, I Googled Zach Bretler, dead boy, Thames, balcony, and there was nothing. His parents had actually very effectively kept the thing out of the press. There was no record on the internet that he'd even died. And this is 4 years later. So what happened was when Zach went missing and then was eventually found dead, the police basically said to the family, we're going to get to the bottom of this. We will move heaven and earth to figure it out. And the family, in a way that I think they would now say was maybe naive, kind of placed their faith in the authorities. And the police actually ended up arresting those two men, Akbar Shamji and Verinder Sharma, on suspicion of murder and questioning them extensively about Zach's death. But they didn't end up charging either of them. And eventually the investigation just kind of ran aground. And there was always this suggestion that the police had. They never would kind of come out and say it in a definitive way, but they would always say, 19-year-old kid goes off the balcony of a luxury building. Doesn't suicide make the most sense? Wouldn't it ultimately be a suicide? And Zach's parents really fiercely resisted that conclusion. And so really a big part of what London Falling is about is these two parents who initially place their faith in the authorities, hoping that the authorities will get to the bottom of it. Then when they don't, Matthew and Rochelle have to kind of become detectives themselves and solve the case as best they can in a way that the police force in London, just for one reason or another, wasn't interested in doing.
There's a theme that also comes out there of lack of coordination, dysfunction inside law enforcement, but also a very 2010s idea of the hollowing out of police resources, especially in investigative agencies such as Scotland Yard. So it's another layer on this picture of London at that particular time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's funny. There's a few moving parts here. Certainly in the U.S., I think it's funny. We there's that service BritBox, and I think we all watch lots of like British crime procedurals.
People are dying everywhere in Britain.
All
We
over
know
the place.
from
Exactly.
the TV. Yes,
exactly. It's a dangerous place, but there is a kind of sense of when this book came out, I think among some readers in the U.S. there was a sense of kind of not Scotland Yard, that people sort of still believe in the overweening competence of Scotland Yard. The truth is that Scotland Yard has really not been fit to purpose for quite some time. And there's been decades of cutbacks and, as you say, a kind of a hollowing out. There's also a kind of subplot in my book about the fact that over the last 2 decades, there has been this spate of, there's been this kind of series of mysterious deaths of people linked to Russia. So people falling off of buildings and falling out of windows and falling in front of tube trains.
Gravity seems to be a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
If you know a certain kind of Russian.
It really is.
Yeah.
You gotta watch out for gravity. It's a killer. And when these cases would happen, there was a tendency by the police to say, must be an accident, must be a suicide, and not to pursue. And so in some respects, I think that Zach's death falls in that pattern. You have this kid who goes off a balcony. He had been claiming to be the son of a Russian oligarch, and the police were just sort of like, might just be easier for everyone if we... They never officially said it was a suicide, but if we kind of say, I don't know what's going on here, but can't rule out suicide.
So Matthew and Rochelle pick up the police investigation and carry it forward. You get involved in this process, and then you pick up essentially an investigation as well. You went through a process of speaking to as many people as you could who knew Zach. Was everyone willing to share what they knew about him?
No, not at all. I mean, quite the contrary. There was an interesting thing that happened to him in death. I think it was very hurtful to his parents, which is that because there was this cloud of ambiguity around his death, there were rumors in London that he'd gotten involved with the Russians. He died in this way that felt, again, it was when you know that there have been 24 deaths like this in London, there was a sort of tendency for people to read his death as part of this pattern. And a big reaction that people had was, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to be near this. This feels dangerous to me, and I don't want to be anywhere near the danger. So there were people I tracked down who wouldn't talk to me, people who knew him well, who didn't want anything to do with it. In a way that's kind of heartbreaking, his teachers at his school wouldn't talk about him. I think there was an order at the school for them to clam up. But you can imagine it's painful for the parents to know that I was just trying to figure out, not even about who he was in death, but just who he was in life. Like, what was he like to have in a class? And they wouldn't talk to me. But there were, fortunately, other people who did. I mean, the way I work is I reach out to everyone, and usually most of them say no. But as long as you get a critical mass of people who will talk, you can get what you need. And in this case, I found former classmates, I found longtime friends, I found other family members, people I'd interacted with.
Just as a sidebar, I'd love to talk about that process for a second. Are you literally sitting down at your desk one day with a long list of people and phone numbers, and you just start dialing?
100%. My job is lists.
And then it's no, 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 and then you catch somebody who's willing to pick up that conversation.
Yeah, and my hit rate is always really low. I mean, I actually think it's one of those things that, for whatever, perversely, I love this about the job, that, like, I've been doing this 20 years. I do it, I think, at a fairly high level. I've had some success. None of that stuff counts for anything.
So you haven't gotten better at it. Your hit rate doesn't get better.
No. Well, in some ways I've picked up a few skills, but it's not a thing where it's not, unfortunately, and I tell young journalists this, like, it's not going to be a thing where one day you've arrived and it all gets really easy. It's always hard, and you always have to you sort of have to embrace the suck and just know that you're gonna get rejected, and that's part of the job, and you gotta have a thick skin, and you don't take it too personally, and there's always more people you can call.
There are threads all the way through this that, as a reader, feel like they're just begging to be pulled on. People involved with powerful Russians falling out of windows seems like one of those threads that we just love to hear more about, but also seems like one of those things that you have to decide how far down the rabbit hole are you going to go. Like, how far off on a side quest are you willing to go to look at other people who have fallen out of windows versus focusing in on this one particular story? How do you keep the scope under control?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is I have this phone in my pocket, and it is a distraction machine, and it beeps and it whirs and it vibrates and it lights up, and it has broken my brain. And I don't read books the way I used to. I still read a lot, but I look back with nostalgia at the kind of reader I was before I got a smartphone, at the kind of concentration I was capable of, the pleasure that I took in just, like, lying on the couch and reading for 2 hours without reaching for any other kind of stimulus. And I miss that. And when I'm writing, I want to try and create that experience for a reader. And I know that it's a high bar to do that, because I am competing with this like purpose-designed distraction whirligig that is, like, in your pocket or in your hand while you're reading the book.
That's the competition.
That's the competition. It's stiff competition. Now, I would make a case for this kind of writing. I think done right, it's super pleasurable, and I'm trying to write books that are seductive, that pull you in. I want you to forget to check your phone. That's the kind of highest ambition. But what that means is that I'm always giving thought to, if I'm going to have a digression, if we're going to go down a rabbit hole, how long are we going to be there? Is it really justified? I never want you to have that moment where you're thinking, why on earth am I learning about this thing that doesn't feel fascinating or doesn't feel like it connects in? Having said that, like, the little detours, I actually think are kind of a secret weapon.
There are some good detours.
There's some great detours. Yeah. And also, I think that as readers, It's funny because I've done some screenwriting over the years, and this is a thing that actually you see, it's done more often in television than it is in nonfiction, but it's a thing that I will shamelessly use in nonfiction because I think it's really pleasurable, which is in TV, they call it the cold open, where you're watching some show, you love the show, you know the characters, you know the world, and you start a new episode and you're in some other place, and you are with characters that are not your main characters. Or maybe it's one of your main characters, but they're in some surprising place. And then there's this thing that's actually quite pleasurable, which is that if it's a TV show, it's like you've been deposited in this place, and you're thinking, how are we going to get back to the main road? I know that we're going to end up back on the kind of the main road of the show. How do we do it? So I'll do that all the time. But I think the trick with those kind of cold opens, which I often do, is like it's fun. In this book, you have a moment where you're in London, and then you turn the page and suddenly we're in Uganda in 1972, and Idi Amin is expelling all of the Asian people from Uganda. And eventually we're going to lead back to our characters. But I actually think it's done right. I think it's a secret weapon, because I think if you're reading, the last thing I want is for my reader to be ahead of me. My reader to feel like, oh, I figured this out. I know where we're going. I always want you to feel like I'm the one driving. I know where we're going, and I'm taking you here for a reason. The trick is, if I gave you 25 pages on Uganda in 1972, too much. So you get 4 or 5 pages, which is, I think, probably the max. And so that's the thing I'm always thinking about, is if I'm doing these little detours, it can't be one of those detours where it's so long that you forget that there's a main road at all.
Right. But you are actively writing with the, like, dopamine-addled brain in mind.
Yeah, and I should say, I don't mean that in the sense that I'm dumbing it down. It's not that I'm, like, my books are not TikTok videos. It's not I'm writing in a way that I really want to kind of hold on to you.
You're acknowledging that attention is different.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is I think it's a high bar. Like, I go back and I read New Yorker writers from the 1950s and 60s, some of the greats. I go back and I read, a book that I love and I always revisit, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. And, you read a page and a half about what the landscape looks like. And on the one hand, I kind of envy Capote because I'm thinking, boy, those were the days. And I don't know that that's a terrible thing. It's not that I'm dumbing it down. It's just that in 2026, if I write about what the landscape looks like for a page and a half, people are just going to be flooding the exits the whole time, And so, yeah, I am thinking about an audience today. I want to reach those people and I want to hold on to them.
This book you mentioned is about reinvention. It's about a change in the culture of the city. It's also in many ways just about lying, about how and why a person lies, about the worst case scenario of what can happen if you do. And that centers around Zach, but you uncover so many lies from so many people throughout the book. It's like the uncovering and the sort of discovery of lies, one of the propulsions inside the book.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I definitely thought of it that way. And I think part of what one of the big sort of narrative choices that I made is the main characters in this book are really Rochelle and Matthew, these parents who are grieving, and they're trying to kind of figure out what happened to their son. And I got a ton of access to them so that I was able to write the book in a really kind of close third person where we're really with them. It's very intimate. And the thing that was interesting is that meant that I could tell these stories about, there are scenes in the book where they will meet people and the people will lie to them. But I don't tell you that the people are lying because we're really in their point of view. And often what happened is they would meet people who said, oh yeah, I want to help you. I knew your son. I want to help you out. And it was only later that they found out that those apparently nice people were completely lying. And so it was a sort of a choice for me. It was rather than tell you at the beginning all the things that you're going to know at the end, I'd rather have you be right there with them in their point of view where you meet this person and their first feeling was, oh my God, this person is so kind. They're helping us. And they would express their gratitude. They'd say, thank you so much for being so kind and helpful, trying to help us find our son. And it's only much later that you find out that that person was completely lying about all of it. It's really pretty shocking.
Britain has a history of frauds and imposters. And I've sometimes wondered if the obsession with class and with strata and pedigree makes that idea of being an imposter especially tantalizing, the idea of passing yourself off as someone from a different level than yourself. But this story adds what I can only describe as 21st century grifter culture on top of that, appearance over substance, with these like feedback loops in social media and popular culture. It seems like you found examples of all of those all the way through this book, from classic, frauds and imposters right through to, 21st century, like, social media grifts.
Totally, yeah. And it's interesting. That's a fascinating observation about the class system. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right that because, race, for instance, somebody's race is kind of irreducible on some level. You can see it when somebody's walking down the street. It is really interesting to have these situations in which you have kind of power dynamics encoded in a society, but they're not visible. That if you see the person, you couldn't necessarily tell, is this person working class? Is this person an aristocrat? What have you? And so there's more opportunities for somebody to kind of pass as something that they're not. Yeah, you definitely had the kind of more traditional frauds, and those people are in this story for sure. But then, I guess the thing I would say, and it's almost a defense of Zach in a weird way, is that, Zach was born in 2000. Zach was 16 when Donald Trump was elected president. Zach lived in an era of influencers and reality TV and people who fake it till they make it, and eventually like crypto and meme coins. And I just think if Zach looked around as a teenager and said, the way my parents did it, which is that you get a job, you go to college, you get a job, you make a living, you slowly work your way up, you squirrel away money, you try and save, you live within your means, you try and live a righteous life, and then eventually, hopefully, you have a comfortable retirement, and then you die. I don't want any of that. What he was saying is like, that's for suckers. And besides, maybe I'll never have enough money to own my own house. Maybe I won't get a job.
And
the future's
none of that
uncertain.
has an Austin Martin in it.
Well, exactly. And what
that?
I want is I want to bet big. I want to put all my chips into the middle of the table, take a big swing. And if that means I have to lie, I think he looked around, and you look around the culture, and there are all kinds of people who did that, and then they ultimately kind of did make it. Like they sort of pretended to be the thing, and then they became the thing that they were pretending to be. And so, on the one hand, Zach was obviously pathological, and he flew too close to the sun, and he died. On the other hand, I have always thought that if he had survived that night, he might today be a really successful real estate developer in London.
And it's funny, when I was thinking about grifter culture, actually, Zach wasn't the person I was thinking of. I was thinking of all of these other people around him, attached to him, attracted to him because of the money that sat behind him. And it made me think about your previous bestseller, Empire of Pain, which explored the Sackler family, the origins of the opioid epidemic, but also the web of relationships and enablers and protectors who surrounded them. And it seemed like one of the common themes between those two books is people who should know better. People who have all the advantages but still choose, that, easier, richer, but compromised path.
Yeah, and listen, I mean, I don't, it's hard because I want my books to be pleasurable to read. They're not sermons, delivered from the lectern. But I do feel strongly about the kind of moral rot that's out there and the compromises that people make and the compromises that people make who have other options. And I think that there are an astonishing number of people who will do bad things in the name of, shareholder value. Or even just like, I want to take care of my own family. It's really important that I need to have kind of generational wealth to take care of my own family, or whatever the thing is. Everybody tells themselves a different story, I suppose, but I am always staggered the people who are really interesting to me are not the people who are just like straight up evil in terms of their choices. I mean, there are some people who are just kind of completely morally vacant. It's what's interesting to me is the ring or two around them of people who, as you say, should know better, don't need to be doing. They're not doing this because they're This is not Jean Valjean. They're not like destitute and like stealing a loaf of bread to feed their family.
This is a lawyer deciding to be a crooked lawyer instead of a lawyer.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or in the case of my book about the Sacklers, the first character you meet is Mary Jo White, who was the former chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission under Barack Obama. She was a legendary law partner, a woman who was a great hero to many female lawyers because she broke a lot of glass ceilings as a young woman doing corporate law. And she, represented the Sacklers like the first time out when they were doing some pretty horrendous things. and then afterwards, when they continued to do, like, she sort of got them off, basically, in effect. And then they continued to do horrendous things, causing a public health crisis that ultimately killed hundreds of thousands of people. And she stuck by them. And there's a line in Empire of Pain where somebody's talking about, the principle that, everybody is entitled to a good lawyer. And it was a law professor who said, everybody's entitled to a lawyer, but that doesn't mean it has to be you.
Zach's mother, Rochelle, said to you that she wondered about how raising Zach in London specifically contributed to his death. But there's also a lot of obvious upside to raising kids in a big city. I think as parents, we're constantly weighing risks against benefits and opportunities. It makes me think about and reflect on the choices I've made for my own kids. How often through this process were you reflecting on your own choices as a parent or how you might parent in the future?
It's funny, when I finished the manuscript a long time before it was published, when I wrote the final page, I sent it to one of my best friends who this guy I went to college with, who lives in the Bay Area, and he read it and he called me and he said it was such an interesting experience reading this book because for the first half of the book it's like a thriller, it's like a mystery, it has this kind of momentum to it, and then you're so kind of caught up in the momentum that you don't realize, but sort of halfway through, he said, suddenly I realized it's actually a book about parenthood, about parenting, and about grief. And listen, I naturally reflected on that. I have two kids of my own. They're adolescents. They're both boys, so not dissimilar to Zach's family, where he had his big brother Joe. There was a review of my book, in the New York Review of Books by a terrific Irish writer, Mark O'Connell, and he said something about how he talked about how the reality is that as soon as you have a child, you introduce a level of contingency and chance into your life that wasn't there before. That there's just this, we might tell ourselves we can control it, but the truth is we really aren't able to control it. You can make what you feel are the best decisions for your child, but there's just an element that's kind of beyond your control. So it was a thing I thought about a lot. I think it, in a way that's helpful, I think it helped me relate to the Brettlers as a family. I really felt a great deal of compassion for them because they make a whole series of choices about how to parent Zach. And I think there's a kind of easy reading of the book. Occasionally I'll encounter readers who are this way. Will say, well, I never would have done X, or well, I would have done that. Why didn't they do Y? And I think it's kind of easy to Monday morning quarterback that stuff. I think when you're in the moment and it's your kid, particularly when the kid is 18 and could just leg it, could just take off if they wanted to, I think these choices are exquisitely difficult.
Patrick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Patrick Radden Keefe, author of London Falling, A Mysterious Death in a Gilded City and a Family's Search for Truth. Find it and Patrick's other incredible books at Kobo and Conversations, home on the web, kobo.com/conversation. Check the show notes for a link. Follow us on your podcast player to catch every episode, and if you enjoy this one, tell somebody about it. Kobo and Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamlin. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, sir.
That was great.